The room is cold, not the sharp cold of winter air, but the kind that settles into stone and never leaves. Your blanket is rough, heavy with the smell of damp fabric and neglect. You clutch it because it is the only thing that feels like it belongs to you. Through a narrow slit of a window, light enters in fragments, thin, pale, enough to show dust floating slowly, endlessly, as if time itself has grown tired. You are a child, 7 years old, perhaps. No one has ever told you. No one has ever told you much of anything at all. If anyone still remembered your name, it might have been Ferdinand or Franz or Maria, or a name now erased from every record that mattered. You were born into a family that ruled empires, commanded armies, and claimed that God himself had chosen their bloodline. And yet, here you are hidden, silent, unseen, because your mind works differently. And in royal history, that difference was unforgivable across centuries. Behind palace walls thick enough to silence screams and prayers alike, there existed a hidden population of royal children, whose lives were quietly rewritten or erased entirely, sons and daughters born into power, privilege, and divine entitlement, yet denied the most basic recognition of all, that they were human beings worthy of being seen. These were children born with what we now understand as Down syndrome. Today, we know Down syndrome as a genetic variation caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21. We understand its traits, its challenges, its realities. We know that people with Down syndrome can live meaningful lives, feel joy, pain, love, curiosity, and belonging. But for most of history, none of that knowledge existed. And in royal families where perfection was not just desired, but politically necessary, difference became danger. To understand why these children were hidden, we must first understand what monarchy truly was. Royal power did not rest solely on armies or wealth. It rested on belief. The belief that kings and queens were chosen by God, that their blood was purer, stronger, closer to the divine than that of ordinary people. Every royal child was not just a son or daughter, but a symbol, a future alliance, a living argument for why one family deserved to rule millions. A child who could not speak clearly, a child who learned slowly, a child who behaved differently, a child whose face bore traits that courtiers whispered about. Such a child threatened the entire illusion, because if royal blood could produce imperfection, then perhaps it was not divine after all. And so, these children were not celebrated. They were not educated for rule. They were not gently integrated into family life. They were concealed. In 1793, in Vienna, a child believed to be related to Emperor Leopold II lived his entire early life within a forgotten tower of the Habsburg palace. Servants were instructed never to speak to him unless necessary. No tutors were assigned. No formal education was attempted. He was fed, cleaned, and kept out of sight, not because he was dangerous, but because his existence was inconvenient. While his cousins studied philosophy and languages, rehearsed court etiquette, and prepared for lives of power, he watched dust drift through a single beam of light for hours at a time. That was his world. Silence, stone, waiting, and royal logic. This was considered mercy. This pattern repeated itself across Europe. In Britain, Prince John, the youngest son of King George V, was born in 1905. At first, he appeared healthy. He was photographed in sailor suits, smiling beside his siblings. But by early childhood, seizures began. Doctors noted developmental delays and physical traits we now associate with Down syndrome, though the term was never used publicly. By the age of 4, Prince John disappeared from public life. He was sent to Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham estate, not a palace, not a court, a quiet place where he lived under the care of a single nurse, Charlotte Lullabill. She loved him. She kept his drawings. She noted his delight in small pleasures, watching gardeners work, collecting acorns, laughing at games only he understood. His parents rarely visited. When Prince John died at 13 after a severe seizure, Queen Mary described his death as a release, a mercy. The language is revealing. Release from what? Mercy from whom? Between the words, we see the truth. A child whose life was framed not as living, but as enduring. France offers an even colder glimpse. In 1640, whispers spread through the palace of Fontainebleau after the birth of a frail infant to King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria. Official records mention only a child who failed to thrive and died shortly after birth. But private letters between royal physicians, uncovered centuries later. The scribe features unmistakably consistent with Down syndrome. The child lived only 43 days. Yet even in death, blame was demanded. Wet nurses were interrogated, astrologers consulted, pilgrimages undertaken. No one dared say the obvious truth that nature varies, even in royal blood, because to say that would mean admitting that God had not made an exception for kings. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty hid its secrets behind layers of silence. While history remembers Tsarevich Alexei and his hemophilia, few records mention the infant daughter born in 1882 to Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich. Official genealogies simply state that a daughter died young, yet payroll records tell another story. For 16 years after her supposed death, servants were paid to staff a secluded nursery wing of the Alexander Palace. Letters from ladies-in-waiting describe a girl who never learned to speak fluently, who clutched dolls well into adolescence, who laughed at falling snow and wandered barefoot into winter gardens if not watched closely. When revolution came in 1917, she vanished completely. Whether she was hidden, abandoned, or killed, no one knows. Revolutions erase many things, especially inconvenient truths. In Spain, the consequences of denial became increasingly visible. The Habsburg dynasty, infamous for generations of inbreeding, produced multiple children with developmental disabilities. Charles II, known as the Bewitched, is remembered for his physical deformities and limited cognitive abilities, but behind him were siblings and cousins who never appeared in portraits at all. Spanish court physicians wrote encoded Latin of infants with Mongol features, a term reflecting the ignorance of the time. These children were denied names, denied titles, denied history. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, dared to suggest in his private notes that these children were not cursed, but simply part of God's creation. That difference did not imply inferiority. For this, he was condemned by the Inquisition. His notes survived only because they were hidden in the false binding of a medical text. The Ottoman Empire followed its own brutal logic. In a system where princes were expected to fight for the throne and weakness invited death, a child with developmental delays could not be allowed to exist publicly. One such prince, son of Sultan Mehmed III, was officially recorded as having died in infancy.